first explain to us why business leaders traditionally migrate to the GOP?
Well, I think part of it probably has to do with income. People in higher income brackets tend to like lower taxes. Why that's the case, we'll never know, but it's definitely been true that I think there's tends to be a conservative streak for the most part among business leaders, and certainly among the business lobbying organizations. When you look at, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, they look for pro-business candidates, and pro-business is usually shorthand for low taxes, small government, and let me make as much profit as I can.
Yeah, and so that's traditionally GOP. So why are business leaders now distancing themselves from the Republican Party?
Well, it's interesting, and of course, not everyone is. There, a number of leaders, whether it's Patrick Byrne of Overstock, who's one of the election deniers, a lot of people from fossil fuel companies, or if you have a deeply sort of Christian background, a lot of those have come out very openly for Republicans. I think what's happening, though, there's two interesting trends. One is what I would call stakeholder capitalism. And of course, I'm not the first to coin that term, but there's been a lot of pressure from employees, from investors, from vendors to have corporate leaders speak out on issues like abortion, issues like the election, frankly, election denial. And so whereas the GOP has swung further right, I think there's a lot more pressure on those business leaders to really come out. And when they do come out, to basically speak in favor of democracy, in favor of news not being fake, in favor of the elections having been legitimate. And we've seen the cost, which we can talk about later, to those leaders who've done that, especially in states like Florida, where they've run afoul of Ron DeSantis. The second reason, I think most basically, is that there was a poll earlier this year from Morning Consult and others where business leaders are very worried about the future of democracy. So the same things that concern a lot of people in this country regarding the January 6th riots and, of course, the denial of the results from the last election, are affecting these leaders as well. And so the stakes seem very high. And if that's the case, they're voting really for the Democrats.
And are we seeing this shift happen because millennials and Gen X are rising the ranks in corporations?
I think that's a very good point, because if you talk to CEOs, which I seem to spend a lot of my days doing, what are the top issues they have in their minds? Sustainability is certainly one they have to be open on, diversity, and the talent shortage. And even in this economy right now, there is a war for talent, and that war is for millennials and for Gen Z primarily. And that is those are two generations that really, frankly, care about climate change. They certainly, like most Americans, are pro-choice when it comes to abortion, and they're deeply concerned about some of the rhetoric from the Republican Party. So I think that is one very important factor, that's just simply the people coming up through the ranks, and the fact that those people are also putting pressure on leaders to speak out. It's not acceptable anymore to hide behind a no comment if you're running a company.
And is this unprecedented? Has any other generation sort of, forced their corporations to speak out on social issues?
I think that there is a history of doing this, and in times of trouble, certainly, and, where companies in the 1960s had to take a stance with regard to whether they were supplying arms to Vietnam. So I think where you've had these very large generations of, large proportion of the population being young, which we do have right now as well, with the millennials and Gen Z coming up through the workforce. That certainly is one factor. But I think the other thing that is probably different and unprecedented is just the reality of social media and the extreme transparency that we have now. So, if you send out an email to your staff, guaranteed that will get out into the public. And I think the speed with which news sort of travels around the world, travels around the company, means that you have to take a stance on these issues. You have to be public. And when you're going to open your mouth, you're going to want to say something that appeals to multiple stakeholders, not just the way you plan to vote.
Is this mostly impacting larger corporations, or are we also seeing it with smaller corporations as well, or smaller businesses even?
I think probably both. And, if you're a larger corporation, there is more pressure on you to come out and take a stance. And if you have to take a stance, obviously you want to take a stance that appeals to the widest majority of your stakeholders. But I think for small businesses, there is the same pressure as well. And the reality is that there can be a disconnect between what you say and what you do, whether you're a large company or a small company. And so what you say in public with regard to where you stand on climate change, abortion rights, et cetera, may be very different than when you get into the privacy of the polling booth. But certainly, the larger the company, the more people want to hear from you and where you stand on these issues.
So, Diane, I think a big example we saw here was the clash between Disney and Ron DeSantis down in Florida. Can you expand on that?
Yes, well, this started with what's now known as the Don't Say Gay law, which was basically a law passed that was to forbid teachers from talking about sexual identity, transgender rights, same-sex marriage, et cetera, in the classroom. And under pressure from employees, the Disney CEO had to speak up. So that's the first thing. Given a choice, he probably would have stayed silent for the very reasons of what followed, which is that when he did take this stance that he and the company were against this law, the governor basically stepped in and initiated, bills to essentially strip Disney of its tax status. And of course, it became another polarizing issue, which no CEO wants to find themselves in the crosshairs of. But if you have to appeal to one constituency, far better to appeal to your employees and frankly most of your customer base than to try to appeal to the right wing of the GOP.
So, how much did this impact Disney's bottom line, do you think?
Ultimately, I don't think it's a good question. If it is stripped of tax status, that of course is going to have an impact. That determines where a lot of companies move, but it is a long-standing inhabitant of Florida when it comes to the theme parks. It has been a wonderful year for travel, frankly. People are calling it revenge travel, and the Disney parks have been a big beneficiary of that. And of course, the company is far more than just the parks and far more than its operations in Florida. So I don't think that the bottom line took a big hit. And I think that also in the minds of probably many of its consumers and certainly its employees, I think it was the right thing to do, and that may have potentially even saved it money when it comes to people voting with their feet in their pocketbooks.
So, overall, do you think that corporations are foregoing more profits by embracing these liberal leaning policies or standards?
No, I think that what's happening is that there is a recognition that the world has changed. And so, if you're looking at long-term growth for any company, you want to at least be making moves in the right direction with regard to climate change. You want to be on the right side of history when it comes to embracing inclusion, diversity, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ plus rights. So I think that, yes, businesses always love low taxes. They love incentives. There have been many complaints about some of the legislation passed under the Biden administration. So let's not get ahead of ourselves and say that business as a whole and business leaders are voting for Democrats. Of course, it's a very divided race. And this is really about the rhetoric and about the messaging. So I think what they want is they want the best conditions for business. And I think there's a more nuanced recognition that best conditions means having an inclusive society based on trust. And the thing that leaders want most is stability and predictability. Stock markets love it, business leaders love it, and frankly, a lot of the rest of us love it too, which is we want to be able to trust our institutions, trust the results of an election, and also feel that everybody in our company feels that they belong.